Sometimes the place that changes your life is the one you never planned to visit. Rachel Carter repeated those words quietly as she guided her SUV along the winding coastal highway toward the small town of Cogwick, Maine. She had accepted what was supposed to be a straightforward architectural assessment of several aging waterfront properties before a regional preservation committee decided whether restoration or redevelopment made more sense. It sounded like another temporary assignment, another town she would leave behind after finishing sketches, reports, and structural inspections. Yet the moment the welcome sign appeared beside the road, something felt unexpectedly different. Cogwick rested between rocky cliffs and the Atlantic Ocean, where weathered cedar homes overlooked the water and fishing boats drifted gently inside a quiet harbor. Everything seemed peaceful, but Rachel noticed something unusual almost immediately. Many of the buildings had been carefully maintained despite their age, while others remained untouched as though time itself had deliberately paused. Even more curious were the expressions of the people she passed. Friendly smiles appeared quickly enough, yet every conversation seemed to stop whenever someone mentioned the old Eastern District near the shoreline. Rachel checked into a small family-owned inn where the owner welcomed her warmly before casually mentioning that the town historical archive could answer most questions about the neighborhood she planned to survey. When Rachel asked why so many homes remained empty despite their excellent condition, the owner hesitated for only a second before replying that every town had stories people preferred to leave undisturbed. The answer raised more questions than it solved. After unpacking her camera, measuring equipment, and notebooks, Rachel decided to explore the waterfront before sunset. The salty breeze carried the familiar scent of the Atlantic while seabirds circled above wooden docks that had served generations of fishermen. She photographed old warehouses, lighthouse beams sweeping across the bay, and rows of cottages glowing beneath golden evening light. Every image seemed to capture more than architecture. They hinted at lives, memories, and quiet histories hidden beneath layers of weathered wood and stone. Near the end of the harbor stood an elegant brick building with polished brass lettering that read Cogwick Historical Archive. Curious, Rachel stepped inside. Tall shelves filled with carefully preserved journals, maps, photographs, and local records stretched across the warmly lit reading room. Behind a large oak desk, a woman looked up from an open archival box and greeted Rachel with a calm, welcoming smile. "You must be the architect everyone has been expecting," she said. "I am Claire Bennett." Rachel introduced herself, immediately noticing Claire's quiet confidence and thoughtful manner. Claire listened patiently as Rachel explained her assignment before offering to help locate original construction records for the waterfront district. Together they unfolded century-old maps across a large wooden table, comparing faded property boundaries with modern survey documents. As they worked, Rachel realized Claire possessed an extraordinary knowledge of Cogwick's past, describing individual homes, former residents, and long-forgotten businesses with remarkable precision. Their conversation flowed naturally, moving from architecture to photography, then from local history to favorite coastal landscapes. Hours passed almost unnoticed until the archive prepared to close for the evening. Before Rachel left, Claire handed her a copy of an old neighborhood survey. "There is one cottage you should visit first," she said gently. "Most people overlook it because they believe nothing important ever happened there." Rachel smiled politely, folded the map into her notebook, and thanked her for the recommendation. Walking back toward the inn beneath a sky filled with fading shades of orange and blue, she glanced once more toward the distant eastern shoreline where a solitary weathered cottage stood quietly above the sea. She could not explain why, but deep inside, she felt certain that whatever secret Cogwick had guarded for generations was waiting for her there, and that meeting Claire Bennett was only the beginning of a journey that would change far more than the future of an old coastal town. The next morning, Rachel woke before sunrise, unable to shake the feeling that the weathered cottage Claire had mentioned held far more than aging timber and cracked stone. Soft golden light spread across the harbor as fishing boats quietly departed for the open Atlantic, their engines blending with the distant cries of gulls. After a quick breakfast at the inn, Rachel gathered her camera, laser measuring device, notebook, and architectural plans before driving toward the eastern shoreline. The narrow road curved between towering pine trees until the cottage finally came into view. Standing alone on a rocky bluff overlooking the ocean, the old house possessed a quiet dignity despite years of exposure to coastal storms. Weathered cedar shingles had faded into soft shades of gray, climbing roses wrapped gently around the front porch, and large windows reflected the endless blue water beyond. Rachel stepped out of her vehicle and slowly walked around the property, studying every beam, stone foundation, and carefully crafted detail. The structure showed signs of remarkable workmanship that exceeded what she expected from an ordinary family home built more than a century earlier. Someone had invested extraordinary care into its design. As she photographed carved window frames and measured exterior walls, she noticed several unusual symbols etched into the cornerstones beneath the porch. They resembled compass markings rather than decorative carvings. Curious, she sketched them into her notebook before continuing the inspection. A familiar voice interrupted her concentration. Claire approached along the gravel path carrying a leather satchel filled with folders and rolled maps. She smiled warmly before explaining that she thought Rachel might appreciate several original property surveys preserved in the archive. Together, they spread the fragile documents across a small wooden table on the porch. Rachel immediately noticed that the oldest survey showed an additional room that no longer appeared on any modern blueprint. Claire admitted that generations of local historians had never been able to explain the discrepancy because later records simply omitted the space without documenting any renovation. Rachel frowned thoughtfully. Buildings rarely lost entire rooms without leaving structural evidence. She suggested they inspect the interior carefully before drawing conclusions. The front door opened with surprising ease, revealing polished wooden floors, handcrafted moldings, and rooms preserved almost as though someone had quietly cared for them until recently. Dust rested lightly upon furniture, but nothing appeared neglected. Rachel examined wall thicknesses, ceiling heights, and support beams while Claire compared every measurement with the century-old floor plan. The deeper they explored, the more obvious the inconsistencies became. According to the original survey, the hallway beside the staircase should have extended several additional feet. Instead, one interior wall appeared unusually thick. Rachel measured it twice before looking toward Claire. Neither woman spoke immediately because both reached the same conclusion at the same moment. Something had been concealed inside the house. Rather than forcing anything open, Rachel carefully searched for signs of later construction. She noticed faint scratches across the hardwood floor near an antique bookshelf positioned against the suspicious wall. The heavy shelves looked original, yet subtle grooves suggested they had been moved countless times over the decades. Claire gently ran her fingertips along the carved wood before discovering a nearly invisible brass latch hidden beneath an ornamental leaf design. Their eyes met with quiet excitement. Before touching the mechanism, they paused, understanding that whatever waited behind the hidden panel might answer questions that had remained unsolved for generations. Rachel slowly wrapped her fingers around the small brass handle while the morning sunlight streamed through the hallway windows, illuminating countless floating dust particles. Taking one steady breath, she carefully released the latch, and somewhere deep inside the old cottage, a quiet click echoed through the silence, promising that Cogwick's forgotten history was finally ready to reveal its first long-protected secret. The hidden latch released with a soft metallic click, followed by the quiet sound of old wood shifting somewhere behind the bookshelf. Rachel and Claire exchanged a brief glance before carefully pushing against the heavy shelves together. Slowly, the entire bookcase moved several inches, revealing a narrow wooden doorway that blended almost perfectly into the surrounding wall. It was crafted with such remarkable precision that even Rachel, with years of architectural experience, admitted she would never have noticed it without the original survey and Claire's careful attention to detail. A cool current of air drifted from the concealed space, carrying the faint scent of aged cedar, old paper, and the unmistakable freshness of the nearby ocean. Rachel switched on her flashlight while Claire carefully opened the hidden door. Beyond it lay a small reading room untouched by time. Built-in shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, holding dozens of carefully arranged journals, rolled maps, leather-bound ledgers, and framed photographs protected beneath a thin layer of dust. A writing desk faced a narrow window overlooking the Atlantic, allowing natural light to enter even after decades of silence. Nothing appeared abandoned in panic. Instead, every object suggested that someone had intentionally preserved the room, believing it would eventually be discovered by the right people. Rachel slowly approached the desk and lifted the first journal with extraordinary care. The elegant handwriting belonged to a woman named Margaret Holloway, whose earliest entries described life in Cogwick more than 100 years earlier. Margaret wrote about preserving local history, documenting family stories, sketching coastal buildings, and recording changes within the growing harbor community. Rachel continued reading while Claire quietly examined framed photographs resting upon the shelves. Many showed familiar streets that still existed today, although the faces smiling beside them belonged to generations long gone. One particular journal entry immediately captured Rachel's attention. Margaret described discovering plans that threatened several historic neighborhoods, warning that future generations might never learn the truth if important records disappeared. She explained that preserving evidence mattered more than protecting her own reputation because history deserved honesty rather than convenience. Claire looked toward Rachel with growing curiosity as another remarkable detail emerged. Several pages contained carefully drawn architectural plans matching portions of the cottage that no longer appeared on any official records. Rachel spread the sketches across the writing desk beside modern blueprints she had carried from town. Every hidden wall, concealed passage, and unusual foundation measurement matched perfectly. Someone had deliberately erased those features from later surveys. While continuing their search, Claire noticed a small brass key resting beneath a folded piece of linen. Attached to it was a handwritten note bearing only a single sentence. "The harbor remembers what the records forget." Rachel quietly repeated the words aloud before placing the key inside a protective evidence envelope. Neither woman attempted to guess its purpose. They understood that every discovery deserved careful documentation before conclusions were reached. Together they photographed every journal, every map, every photograph, and every architectural drawing exactly where they had been found. As afternoon sunlight slowly crossed the narrow window, Rachel realized she had completely forgotten about the original inspection assignment. The old cottage had become something far greater than another restoration project. It was an untouched historical archive waiting patiently beneath ordinary walls. Before leaving the hidden room, Claire gently closed the final journal resting on the desk. Inside its back cover, nearly hidden beneath a folded map of Cogwick Harbor, they noticed a faded sketch of a stone warehouse standing beside an abandoned section of the waterfront that no longer appeared on any modern maps. Rachel carefully compared the drawing with satellite images stored on her tablet before looking toward Claire. The shoreline had changed over the decades, but one distinctive granite foundation still remained exactly where Margaret had marked it. Standing together inside the quiet hidden room, they both realized the journals had not simply preserved forgotten history. They were carefully guiding every step toward another place where Cogwick's greatest secret had been waiting for more than a century. The following morning arrived beneath a blanket of soft coastal fog as Rachel and Claire made their way toward the abandoned granite warehouse marked inside Margaret Holloway's journal. The structure stood alone near the oldest section of Cogwick Harbor, where weather docks stretched quietly into calm Atlantic water. Most visitors ignored this forgotten corner of town because newer marinas had replaced its commercial importance decades earlier. Even so, the warehouse itself remained surprisingly well preserved. Thick granite walls had resisted more than a century of storms, while heavy wooden doors still stood firmly upon their original iron hinges. Rachel carefully compared the faded sketch from Margaret's journal with the building before them. Every window, every stone arch, and every carved foundation matched almost perfectly. Claire unfolded one of the original harbor maps across the hood of Rachel's vehicle, tracing an old footpath that no longer appeared on modern planning documents. According to Margaret's notes, the warehouse had once served as a secure storage facility for important civic records before becoming abandoned without explanation. Rachel photographed every exterior detail, while Claire recorded observations inside her notebook. When they finally entered the building, sunlight streamed through narrow windows high above the empty floor, illuminating countless dust particles floating through the quiet air. Wooden shelving lined the walls, although most compartments now stood empty. At first glance, nothing suggested that anything unusual remained inside. Rachel slowly examined the stone foundation while Claire studied several weathered support columns bearing faded inventory markings. One carved symbol immediately caught Rachel's attention because it matched the compass design she had discovered beneath the cottage porch. Curious, she measured the surrounding masonry and noticed one section of wall projected several inches farther than the rest. The difference appeared too precise to be accidental. Together, they gently cleared away stacked wooden crates that had rested against the wall for decades. Hidden behind them stood a narrow cabinet built directly into the stonework. The brass key recovered from Margaret's reading room fit the small lock perfectly. Rachel turned it carefully, and the cabinet opened without resistance. Inside rested several leather folders protected within a waterproof metal case. Claire lifted the documents with extraordinary care before placing them upon a nearby table. They contained correspondence between town officials, architects, surveyors, and local families dating back more than 100 years. As they read through the carefully preserved pages, an unmistakable pattern emerged. Influential investors had quietly planned to purchase large sections of Cogwick's historic waterfront using misleading property agreements that greatly undervalued the land. Margaret had gathered copies of every contract, survey, and letter proving the deception before hiding them where they could survive untouched. She believed that one day someone committed to honesty rather than profit would eventually discover the truth. Rachel paused while reading Margaret's final handwritten note. A town without memory loses more than buildings. It forgets the people who gave it a heart. Claire quietly closed the folder, her expression reflecting both admiration and sadness for the woman who had carried such responsibility alone. They carefully photographed every document before returning each page to its protective case. As they prepared to leave, Rachel noticed another folded map resting beneath the final folder. Unlike the earlier surveys, this one showed the entire historic district with several buildings marked for preservation in Margaret's own handwriting. One location near the center of town had been circled repeatedly. Beside it, she had written only a few carefully chosen words. The council chamber will decide whether truth survives. Rachel looked toward Claire, who slowly nodded in thoughtful silence. The evidence they had uncovered was no longer simply a remarkable historical discovery. It had become the key to protecting Cogwick's identity before history repeated the same mistake once again, and both women understood that the next step would place everything they had uncovered before the people responsible for deciding the town's future. Over the following several days, Rachel and Claire worked carefully inside the historical archive, determined to organize every discovery before presenting it to the town council. Rather than rushing toward dramatic conclusions, they compared Margaret Holloway's journals with original property surveys, harbor construction records, handwritten correspondence, and county land registrations preserved in climate-controlled storage. Each verified document strengthened the same remarkable conclusion. Margaret had not simply collected local history. She had intentionally preserved evidence, proving that Cogwick's oldest waterfront district had narrowly escaped a series of misleading redevelopment agreements more than 100 years earlier, because several respected residents quietly refused to surrender the town's cultural identity. Rachel photographed every page using professional archival techniques, while Claire prepared detailed reference notes linking each document to official municipal records. Their work attracted growing attention throughout the community. Teachers visited the archive hoping to learn more about the discovery. Longtime residents arrived carrying forgotten family letters stored inside attic boxes for generations, and local newspapers began reporting that previously unknown historical evidence might permanently change how Cogwick understood its own past. During one particularly busy afternoon, Claire received notice that Harbor Crest Development had formally submitted a proposal requesting approval to purchase several aging properties surrounding the eastern waterfront, including the historic cottage Rachel had been surveying. The timing immediately concerned both women. If redevelopment moved forward before Margaret's documents received official historical recognition, several important sites connected to the newly discovered archive could be altered beyond recognition. Rachel quietly studied the proposal before suggesting they prepare a complete preservation report supported by structural analysis, historical documentation, and verified legal records. Claire agreed immediately. Together they spent long evenings combining architectural drawings, historical photographs, authenticated journals, and original land surveys into a carefully organized presentation designed to demonstrate that the entire waterfront district represented one interconnected historical landscape rather than a collection of isolated buildings. Throughout those long hours of work, their conversations gradually shifted beyond architecture and history. Rachel spoke about constantly moving from project to project without ever feeling rooted anywhere, while Claire admitted she had devoted so much time preserving the stories of previous generations that she had rarely considered building a meaningful future for herself. Neither conversation felt forced. Trust had quietly grown through shared purpose, patient listening, and countless ordinary moments spent solving problems together. One evening, after organizing the final archive box, they stepped outside onto the cottage porch overlooking the Atlantic. Warm sunset colors stretched across the calm water, while fishing boats slowly returned toward the harbor. Rachel smiled softly as she admitted that Cogwick already felt more like home than anywhere she had lived during the past several years. Claire looked toward the horizon before answering with quiet honesty that the town had always been special to her, but it had never felt quite as alive until someone else became equally determined to protect it. Their eyes met briefly before both smiled, understanding that something meaningful had begun growing between them without either woman needing to name it. The peaceful silence lasted until Rachel unfolded Margaret's final harbor map once more. Looking carefully at the notes surrounding the old council chamber, she noticed a small handwritten annotation she had overlooked before. Beside the meeting hall, Margaret had written, "The truth survives only when ordinary people choose to speak before it becomes too late." Rachel carefully folded the map and placed it beside the completed preservation report. Tomorrow evening, the town council would gather to discuss the future of Cogwick's waterfront. For the first time since arriving, Rachel realized her assignment was no longer about evaluating old buildings. It had become a responsibility shared with Claire, the community, and the generations who had quietly protected the town's heart long before either of them had ever set foot inside the historic cottage. The following evening, the council chamber filled long before the scheduled meeting began. Residents from every corner of Cogwick gathered inside the historic building, filling rows of polished wooden benches that had witnessed generations of local decisions. Teachers, fishermen, shop owners, retirees, students, and preservation volunteers quietly exchanged conversations while reporters arranged cameras near the back of the room. Rachel stood beside Claire reviewing the final preservation report one last time. Every photograph, architectural drawing, journal page, survey map, and legal document had been carefully organized so each discovery could be explained clearly and honestly. Their goal was not to create drama, but to allow the evidence to speak for itself. As the meeting officially opened, members of the town council welcomed representatives from Harbor Crest Development, who presented polished architectural renderings showing modern hotels, expanded marinas, restaurants, and commercial buildings replacing much of the eastern waterfront. Company officials described increased tourism, economic opportunity, and future investment, emphasizing how redevelopment could benefit the local economy for decades to come. The presentation was professional and optimistic, yet Rachel quietly noticed that none of the proposed plans acknowledged the historical significance of the existing neighborhood. When public presentations began, Claire calmly stepped forward carrying one of Margaret Holloway's original journals. Rather than challenging anyone directly, she explained how months of careful research had connected forgotten family records, original harbor surveys, authenticated correspondence, and architectural evidence into one complete historical record. Rachel followed by presenting detailed structural assessments demonstrating that the historic cottage, the granite warehouse, the concealed reading room, and surrounding waterfront buildings remained structurally suitable for preservation and adaptive restoration. Enlarged photographs displayed the hidden architectural features that had disappeared from later official surveys, while side-by-side comparisons showed how Margaret's original drawings perfectly matched the concealed spaces they had uncovered. Council members carefully examined each exhibit, while independent historians confirmed the authenticity of every supporting document. During the public comment period, local residents began sharing their own experiences. One elderly fisherman described hearing stories about Margaret from his grandfather, remembering how previous generations quietly spoke about someone who had protected important town records without ever seeking recognition. A retired teacher presented family letters referencing the same waterfront properties identified in Margaret's journals. Several younger residents explained that preserving Cogwick's unique character mattered just as much as attracting new economic opportunities because the town's identity could never be rebuilt once it disappeared. Rachel listened quietly, realizing the discoveries had grown beyond anything she and Claire could have accomplished alone. The entire community had gradually become part of the effort to protect its own history. After several hours of thoughtful discussion, the council announced that an independent historical preservation review would immediately begin before any redevelopment decisions could move forward. No final vote would occur until specialists completed a comprehensive evaluation of the newly discovered evidence. Although the process would require additional time, the announcement brought visible relief throughout the chamber. As the meeting concluded, neighbors gathered around Rachel and Claire, thanking them for approaching the discoveries with patience, respect, and careful documentation rather than speculation. Walking outside beneath a clear evening sky, Rachel and Claire paused on the courthouse steps overlooking the quiet streets of Cogwick. Warm lights glowed from nearby storefronts while the distant lighthouse swept its familiar beam across the Atlantic. Rachel smiled softly before admitting that, for the first time in many years, she felt she had contributed to something that would continue helping people long after her work was finished. Claire returned the smile with quiet warmth. Neither woman realized it yet, but the independent review about to begin would uncover one final piece of Margaret Holloway's remarkable legacy, a discovery capable of transforming not only the future of the waterfront, but the entire story of how Cogwick had quietly protected its heart across generations. During the weeks that followed the council meeting, independent preservation specialists arrived in Cogwick to examine every document, building, and historical reference Rachel and Claire had uncovered. Their careful review attracted historians, architects, archivists, and legal researchers from across New England, each bringing additional expertise that strengthened the growing body of evidence. Rather than creating division within the community, the process encouraged residents to rediscover their own family histories. Boxes that had remained unopened for decades were carried into the historical archive. Old photographs appeared from forgotten albums, handwritten letters emerged from attic trunks, and faded journals were generously loaned to researchers. Every contribution added another small piece to the remarkable story Margaret Holloway had quietly protected for generations. Rachel spent each morning assisting preservation architects with detailed structural surveys of the eastern waterfront. Together, they documented original timber framing, handcrafted stonework, and construction techniques rarely preserved so completely along the main coastline. Claire coordinated archival research inside the historical archive, carefully cataloging every newly discovered document according to professional preservation standards. Their partnership had become effortless. Rachel anticipated the practical questions before Claire asked them, while Claire often located historical references that perfectly explained Rachel's architectural observations. The trust between them continued to deepen through countless ordinary moments filled with shared purpose rather than dramatic declarations. One quiet afternoon, while reviewing several newly donated family journals, Claire discovered a folded envelope addressed to the future caretakers of Cogwick. The handwriting immediately matched Margaret Holloway's journals. Inside rested a beautifully written letter explaining why she had concealed so many important records instead of publishing them during her own lifetime. Margaret believed that history could only unite a community if people chose to preserve it together rather than allowing one individual to claim ownership of the truth. She hoped future generations would uncover the evidence only when the town had grown ready to protect its heritage collectively. Rachel listened carefully as Claire read the letter aloud inside the peaceful reading room where their journey had truly begun. Neither woman spoke for several moments afterward because Margaret's words reflected exactly what was happening throughout Cogwick. The The discoveries no longer belonged to historians alone. They belonged to every resident who valued the town's shared memory. Several days later, the independent review reached its conclusion. Specialists confirmed that Margaret's journals, architectural drawings, property records, and legal correspondence were authentic, historically significant, and directly connected to the surviving waterfront district. The review recommended that the eastern shoreline, including the historic cottage, granite warehouse, concealed reading room, and surrounding neighborhood, receive formal heritage protection while restoration planning moved forward using preservation rather than demolition. The announcement was welcomed throughout the town with quiet pride rather than celebration alone. Local business owners discussed opportunities for heritage tourism. Schools began preparing educational programs based on the newly verified history, and volunteers organized community restoration projects for public spaces surrounding the waterfront. Standing together outside the restored archive one peaceful evening, Rachel admitted she had originally accepted the assignment believing she would spend only a few weeks in Cogwick before moving to another project somewhere else. Now the thought of leaving no longer felt natural. Claire smiled gently before suggesting that perhaps some places chose their people just as surely as people chose where to live. Rachel looked across the harbor toward the familiar cottage where everything had begun and realized she could imagine building a future there instead of merely documenting its past. As warm sunset light settled across the Atlantic, a phone call arrived from the State Preservation Office. Officials wished to visit Cogwick personally because one final recommendation had emerged from the review committee, a proposal that could ensure Margaret Holloway's lifelong dedication would be honored permanently while opening an entirely new chapter for both the historic town and the two women whose lives had quietly become part of its continuing story. Several days later, representatives from the State Preservation Office arrived in Cogwick beneath clear autumn skies, bringing with them architects, historians, and cultural heritage specialists eager to examine the remarkable collection of evidence firsthand. Rachel and Claire welcomed the visitors inside the historical archive, where every journal, photograph, architectural drawing, and verified document had been carefully cataloged according to professional archival standards. The specialists spent hours comparing Margaret Holloway's original writings with structural surveys, municipal records, and county property maps before touring the waterfront district itself. Walking together through the quiet streets, they admired the restored craftsmanship visible throughout the neighborhood and repeatedly commented that very few coastal communities had preserved such an authentic historical landscape. Rachel explained the architectural significance of the concealed reading room, the granite warehouse, and the surviving harbor structures, while Claire shared the human stories preserved within Margaret's journals, reminding every visitor that history gained its greatest value through the lives connected to each place. By the end of the inspection, the Preservation Committee announced that it would formally recommend the entire eastern waterfront for state heritage designation. The decision filled the community with quiet gratitude because it protected not only individual buildings, but also the relationships, traditions, and memories that had shaped Cogwick across generations. Local volunteers immediately organized restoration weekends. Students joined historical walking tours, and neighborhood businesses began working together to celebrate the town's unique identity instead of replacing it. Rachel watched the transformation with genuine admiration. Only weeks earlier, she had arrived expecting another temporary assignment, yet now she found herself helping neighbors repaint weathered fences, photograph restored buildings, and document oral histories shared by longtime residents. Claire often worked beside her, recording interviews while Rachel captured portraits of families standing proudly before homes their grandparents had once described inside Margaret's journals. Their partnership extended naturally beyond research. They shared early morning coffee overlooking the harbor before beginning each day's work, exchanged ideas during quiet walks along the shoreline, and discovered how easily conversation continued even after the day's responsibilities had ended. One peaceful evening, they returned to the historic cottage where everything had begun. Warm sunset light filtered through the restored windows as gentle waves rolled against the rocky shoreline below. Rachel paused on the front porch and admitted that she had spent years searching for meaningful projects without realizing that what she truly wanted was a place where her work genuinely mattered to people. Claire smiled softly and confessed that preserving history had always been her greatest passion, but sharing that purpose with someone who understood its importance had made every discovery even more meaningful. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the lighthouse cast its familiar beam across the Atlantic while seabirds drifted above calm water. Neither woman needed dramatic promises because their actions throughout the past weeks had already spoken with quiet honesty. The following morning, an official letter arrived confirming that the state intended to fund the restoration of the historic cottage, the archive, and the surrounding waterfront district as one integrated heritage project. Included within the proposal was a recommendation that Rachel serve as architectural preservation consultant while Claire became director of the expanded historical archive. Looking at the letter together, both women realized the opportunity represented far more than professional recognition. It offered them the chance to remain in Cogwick, protect everything they had uncovered, and continue building a future rooted in the same truth that Margaret Holloway had safeguarded so carefully for generations, proving that some journeys begin with unexpected assignments, but ultimately lead people exactly where they were always meant to belong. Autumn gradually settled across Cogwick as restoration work officially began throughout the protected waterfront district. Craftspeople repaired weathered porches using traditional woodworking methods, preservation architects restored original stone foundations with remarkable care, and volunteers gathered every weekend to clean gardens, repaint fences, and prepare public walking paths that would soon introduce visitors to the town's newly recognized historical treasures. Rachel accepted the position of architectural preservation consultant, knowing the decision meant far more than advancing her career. Every blueprint she reviewed and every restoration plan she approved helped preserve the authentic character that had inspired an entire community to rediscover its own history. Claire officially became director of the expanded historical archive, where she organized exhibitions combining Margaret Holloway's journals, restored photographs, original property surveys, and the remarkable story of how ordinary citizens had quietly protected their heritage across generations. Together, they transformed the archive into a welcoming place where local families, students, historians, and visitors could explore Cogwick's past through carefully preserved records rather than distant legends. The response exceeded every expectation. Schoolchildren arrived with notebooks filled with questions about early harbor life. Retired residents volunteered to record family memories before they were forgotten, and travelers from across the country visited the waterfront after reading articles celebrating Cogwick's preservation success. Rachel often photographed these everyday moments, believing that today's ordinary lives would eventually become tomorrow's history. Claire smiled each time another family donated letters, photographs, or journals that expanded the growing collection. One afternoon, while organizing newly received materials, they discovered a small leather notebook belonging to Margaret Holloway's younger sister. Although much shorter than Margaret's journals, it contained heartfelt reflections describing how Margaret never viewed herself as a hero. Instead, she believed every generation inherited a simple responsibility to leave its community stronger than it had been found. Rachel quietly closed the notebook after reading those words aloud, realizing they described exactly what the people of Cogwick were accomplishing together. Later that evening, Rachel and Claire walked slowly along the restored harbor path beneath a sky glowing with soft shades of orange and lavender. Fishing boats returned peacefully to the docks while families gathered near the waterfront to enjoy the cool evening air. Rachel admitted that, before arriving in Cogwick, she had measured success almost entirely through completed projects and professional recognition. Now she understood that the most meaningful work could never be measured only by reports or architectural drawings. Claire responded that preserving history had taught her a similar lesson. Buildings mattered because they carried human stories, and stories survived because people cared enough to protect them together. Their conversation paused naturally as they reached the historic cottage overlooking the Atlantic. Standing on the familiar porch, Rachel gently reached for Claire's hand. Claire smiled warmly, returning the gesture without hesitation. Nothing about the moment felt hurried or uncertain. Their growing relationship had developed through trust, shared purpose, and quiet companionship, making this simple expression of affection feel completely natural. As evening settled across the coastline, Lights gradually appeared throughout the restored waterfront, reflecting gently across calm ocean water. Rachel looked toward the harbor and realized she no longer imagined returning to the fast-moving career she had left behind. Claire quietly admitted she had hoped Rachel would someday choose to stay, although she never wanted that decision to come from obligation. Rachel answered with complete honesty that she had already chosen. She was no longer simply preserving Cogwick's history. She had become part of it, and together they would soon receive one final opportunity to ensure that Margaret Holloway's extraordinary legacy inspired future generations long after every restoration project had been completed. Winter arrived gently in Cogwick, bringing crisp ocean air, quiet mornings, and a peaceful rhythm that seemed perfectly suited to the town's renewed sense of purpose. Restoration projects continued despite the colder weather, with skilled craftspeople completing interior preservation, while volunteers organized educational exhibits inside the expanded historical archive. Rachel divided her time between supervising architectural restoration and documenting each stage of the work so future generations could understand not only what had been preserved, but how the community had accomplished it together. Claire carefully curated Margaret Holloway's journals alongside newly donated family collections, creating an exhibition that connected more than 100 years of local history through authentic voices rather than simple timelines. Visitors frequently remarked that the archive felt less like a museum and more like stepping into the living memory of an entire town. One morning, Rachel received a phone call from the Boston architectural firm where she had worked for nearly a decade. Her former supervisor congratulated her on the national recognition surrounding Cogwick's preservation project before offering her an exciting promotion, leading several prestigious restoration programs across the East Coast. The opportunity included professional recognition, financial security, and projects many architects dreamed of managing throughout their careers. Rachel thanked her sincerely and promised to consider the offer carefully before making a decision. Although honored by the invitation, she found herself unexpectedly unsettled. That evening she walked alone along the familiar harbor, listening to gentle waves rolling beneath the wooden docks, while soft lights reflected across the calm Atlantic. Every building surrounding her now carried memories connected not only to Margaret Holloway's remarkable legacy, but also to the months she had spent working beside Claire. The historic cottage no longer represented merely an assignment. It had become the place where she rediscovered why architecture mattered in the first place. Later that evening, Rachel shared the news with Claire inside the archive after the last visitors had quietly departed. Claire listened without interruption, offering no advice and placing no expectations upon Rachel. Instead, she smiled warmly and admitted that opportunities like this rarely appeared twice. She explained that genuine affection could never depend upon asking someone to abandon their dreams. Rachel appreciated Claire's honesty, yet the conversation only strengthened what had gradually become clear inside her own heart. The following morning, she visited the restored cottage before sunrise, carrying the same notebook she had opened on her very first day in Cogwick. Reading her earliest observations, she smiled at how differently she now viewed the town. What had once seemed like another temporary destination had become the place where purpose, friendship, community, and love quietly came together. She closed the notebook and telephoned her former supervisor. With sincere gratitude, Rachel declined the promotion, explaining that she had already accepted the most meaningful project of her career. Rather than feeling she had sacrificed an opportunity, she experienced an overwhelming sense of peace. Returning to the archive, she found Claire organizing several newly restored photographs for the upcoming grand reopening celebration. Rachel gently handed Claire a copy of the letter confirming her permanent appointment as Cogwick's architectural preservation consultant. Claire looked up in surprise before Rachel quietly admitted that she was staying because she had finally found a place where both her work and her heart truly belonged. Claire's eyes filled with quiet happiness as she smiled, and together they looked through the large archive windows toward the restored waterfront glowing beneath the winter sun. Neither woman realized that the celebration planned for the following week would include one final tribute honoring Margaret Holloway's lifelong devotion, a moment that would forever connect the past they had uncovered with the hopeful future they were now building together. The day of the grand reopening arrived beneath a brilliant blue winter sky as residents gathered along Cogwick's restored waterfront to celebrate a milestone that few had imagined possible only months earlier. Fresh, evergreen garlands decorated the historic cottage, polished brass plaques reflected the morning sunlight, and colorful banners welcomed visitors from neighboring towns who had traveled to witness the official dedication of the newly protected heritage district. Families filled the streets. Local musicians performed familiar coastal melodies, children carried handmade drawings of the lighthouse and harbor, and volunteers proudly guided guests through exhibitions describing the remarkable discoveries that had transformed the future of the community. Rachel walked beside Claire through the lively waterfront, smiling as they watched neighbors greeting one another with genuine warmth. Every restored building stood as quiet evidence that preserving history could strengthen an entire town rather than preventing its future. Inside the expanded historical archive, the final exhibition had been carefully arranged over many weeks. Margaret Holloway's journals rested inside climate-controlled display cases beside original harbor maps, restored architectural drawings, carefully preserved family photographs, and the simple brass key that had first opened the concealed reading room. Informational displays explained how each discovery connected with verified historical records, allowing visitors to understand not only the remarkable story itself, but also the careful research that supported every conclusion. Throughout the afternoon, Rachel answered questions about architectural preservation while Claire shared the personal stories hidden within the journals, reminding visitors that buildings gained their greatest meaning through the lives connected to them. During the official dedication ceremony, the governor's representative announced that the eastern waterfront had been permanently entered into the state register of protected historical districts. The audience responded with heartfelt applause as Margaret Holloway was formally recognized for her extraordinary dedication to preserving Cogwick's heritage. Although she had never sought public recognition during her lifetime, her quiet determination had ultimately protected the identity of an entire community. A commemorative bronze plaque was unveiled beside the historic cottage, honoring her belief that truth, memory, and compassion should always guide those entrusted with preserving the past. Rachel and Claire stood together watching families gather around the memorial, feeling deeply grateful that Margaret's hope had finally become reality. Later that evening, after the celebration gradually came to a peaceful close, they returned to the familiar porch overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Soft light from the lighthouse swept rhythmically across calm water, while distant fishing boats rested quietly inside the harbor. Rachel reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with what she believed would be another temporary assignment. Instead, she had discovered a community that welcomed her, meaningful work that inspired her, and a partnership built upon mutual respect, shared purpose, and quiet trust. Claire admitted that she had spent many years protecting stories written by others without realizing she was also creating one of her own. Rachel gently reached for Claire's hand once again, and this time neither woman hesitated. Looking toward the peaceful coastline, Rachel softly said that every meaningful place deserved someone willing to care for it with patience and honesty. Claire smiled and answered that the same was true for every meaningful relationship. Together they watched the final colors of sunset disappear beyond the Atlantic horizon, knowing they had found not only the truth hidden inside Cogwick's history, but also a future they genuinely wanted to build together. As evening settled across the restored waterfront, the archive lights continued glowing warmly in the distance, welcoming tomorrow's visitors and quietly reminding everyone who entered that history endured because ordinary people chose to protect what truly mattered, generation after generation. Spring arrived quietly in Cogwick, bringing fresh ocean breezes, blooming gardens, and renewed energy to the historic waterfront that had become a symbol of the town's shared determination. Visitors now traveled from across the country to experience the restored district, walking along weathered docks, exploring the expanded historical archive, and discovering the remarkable story that had transformed an overlooked coastal community into a celebrated example of preservation guided by truth and cooperation. Rachel and Claire welcomed each new season with the same quiet dedication that had carried them through every challenge. Rachel continued overseeing restoration projects throughout the district, ensuring that every repair honored the craftsmanship of earlier generations while preparing each building to serve the community for decades to come. Claire expanded the archive into an educational center where students, researchers, and families explored authentic journals, photographs, architectural drawings, and personal letters that connected the past with the present. Together, they also launched a community history program inviting residents to record family memories before they faded with time. Believing that every ordinary story deserved to become part of Cogwick's living heritage, the program quickly became one of the archive's most meaningful accomplishments. Children interviewed grandparents, longtime fishermen described changing seasons along the harbor, teachers preserved local traditions, and newcomers discovered that they too could contribute to the continuing story of the town. Rachel photographed each participant while Claire carefully organized every recording, document, and image into the growing collection. Looking through the completed archive one afternoon, Rachel quietly observed that Margaret Holloway had never truly worked alone. Her courage had inspired future generations she would never meet, creating a chain of kindness and responsibility that continued long after her lifetime. Claire smiled warmly, agreeing that the greatest legacy was never contained inside journals or buildings alone, but inside the willingness of ordinary people to care for one another and for the places they called home. Their own lives reflected that lesson more each passing day. Simple routines brought unexpected happiness. They shared breakfast overlooking the harbor before beginning work, spent evenings walking along the shoreline discussing new restoration ideas, welcomed neighbors into the cottage for community gatherings, and gradually filled the once quiet house with laughter, conversation, and friendship. The historic cottage itself became both a comfortable home and an informal meeting place where volunteers, historians, architects, and students exchanged ideas over coffee while planning future preservation projects. One afternoon, Rachel discovered the very first notebook she had carried into Cogwick months earlier. Reading the earliest pages, she smiled at the uncertainty she had felt upon arriving in a town she believed she would soon leave behind. Claire gently read the final page Rachel had recently written. It contained only one simple sentence. Sometimes the place you rescue quietly rescues you in return. Claire closed the notebook with a thoughtful smile before placing it beside Margaret Holloway's journals inside the reading room, suggesting that every generation eventually left its own chapter for those who followed. As warm spring sunlight filled the cottage, children playing outside could be heard laughing along the harbor path, while visitors explored the preserved waterfront beyond the windows. Rachel looked around the room, realizing that every promise made during those first uncertain days had quietly become reality. The buildings had been preserved, the history had been protected, the community had grown stronger, and the future they had chosen together felt as enduring as the Atlantic tides beyond the shoreline. Standing beside Claire in the peaceful home where everything had begun, Rachel understood that the greatest discoveries were never hidden behind secret doors alone. Sometimes they waited patiently inside ordinary moments, changing lives one quiet day at a time until an unexpected journey became the beginning of a lasting home. Several years passed, and the story of Cogwick continued to grow in ways Rachel and Claire could never have imagined during those first uncertain days beside the old cottage overlooking the Atlantic. What had once been a quiet coastal town known only to its residents had become a respected destination for people seeking authentic history, thoughtful preservation, and a reminder that communities could thrive without forgetting the values that shaped them. The historic waterfront remained beautifully restored, its weathered buildings carefully maintained by local craftspeople who treated every project as an investment in the future rather than a repair of the past. The expanded historical archive welcomed visitors throughout every season, offering carefully curated exhibitions, educational workshops, and community storytelling events that inspired young and old alike. Rachel continued leading architectural preservation throughout the district, mentoring a new generation of architects who arrived eager to learn how thoughtful restoration could honor both craftsmanship and community. Claire guided the archive with the same quiet wisdom that had first inspired Rachel, encouraging every visitor to see history not as a collection of distant dates, but as the everyday choices made by ordinary people. Together, they remain devoted to preserving Margaret Holloway's remarkable legacy, while also creating a legacy of their own through kindness, patience, and service. Every spring, they organized Harbor Heritage Week, inviting families to explore restored buildings, listen to longtime residents share personal memories, and participate in hands-on preservation activities. Children eagerly searched for architectural details hidden throughout the town. Students interviewed local elders for school projects, and visitors often left with a deeper appreciation for the importance of protecting places filled with shared meaning. One bright summer afternoon, Rachel and Claire returned to the concealed reading room inside the historic cottage. Everything had been carefully preserved exactly as they first discovered it, except for one meaningful addition. Resting beside Margaret Holloway's journals stood a beautifully bound volume titled The Continuing Story of Cogwick. Inside its pages were photographs Rachel had captured over the years, written reflections contributed by Claire, and heartfelt memories shared by countless residents whose voices now formed part of the town's living history. Rachel smiled as she gently turned the pages, recognizing familiar faces that had become treasured friends. Claire quietly observed that Margaret had believed every generation should leave something valuable for the next, and now the people of Cogwick were doing exactly that together. Later that evening, they stepped onto the familiar porch where their remarkable journey had truly begun. The lighthouse cast its comforting beam across calm Atlantic water, while the restored harbor glowed beneath the warm colors of sunset. Fishing boats returned peacefully to their docks, children laughed along the waterfront paths, and families gathered beneath flowering trees that had grown stronger with every passing season. Rachel looked toward Claire with quiet gratitude and reflected that she had once believed success meant constantly searching for the next destination. Instead, she had discovered that the greatest adventure was finding a place where purpose, community, and love could grow together. Claire gently squeezed Rachel's hand before answering that every meaningful story eventually becomes part of someone else's hope. As evening settled over Cogwick, the town continued exactly as Margaret Holloway had dreamed many years before, preserving its history while welcoming tomorrow with open hearts. Rachel and Claire walked home beneath the first evening stars, knowing that although every chapter eventually reaches its final page, the kindness people leave behind continues inspiring countless new beginnings, just as the steady rhythm of the Atlantic waves would forever echo along the shoreline they were proud to call home.